Hey lifers, Dustin here, and in this video I want to do a little bit of a follow-up slash other leg of my what if the Big 12 had stayed intact video that I put out a little while ago, and this one is going to be what if the Pac-16 had formed. Now in June of 2010, the college football equivalent of a nuclear explosion, an impending nuclear attack, was basically forming and running wild on the internet. Anybody that was paying attention to the college football world at that time, it's almost impossible to forget what was going on. Texas, officially the unofficial crown jewel and leader of the Big 12 Conference, was in serious talks with Larry Scott, who was the commissioner of the Pac-10, in order to take themselves and half of the Big 12 with them to form the Pac-16, which even now sounds really weird when I say it. And original talks was Colorado, Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Texas A&M. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Nebraska bolted for the Big Ten, along with eventually Maryland and Rutgers, and Texas A&M and Missouri went eastward towards the SEC, and the Big 12 stayed exactly how it was, with those members getting TCU and West Virginia, as Colorado and Utah ended up joining the Pac-10, making it the Pac-12. But what if that didn't happen? What if we really did have the very first Superconference, and the Pac-16 went the route of the WAC, the original 16-team conference, and tried to have a super conference that really dominated everything west of the Mississippi? What would that have looked like? What would have been the repercussions across the college football landscape? Of course, we don't really know what could have happened, but here is one possible timeline. Now, the Pac-16 would be perfectly set up if they decided to do the pods. That's the idea that the WAC had of 16 teams with 4 teams in each pod. If they decided to do this, it sets up perfectly. They would have Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State being in one pod. We'll call that the Midwest pod, or we'll call it the Midwest pod. They would have Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State in something we'll call the Mountain Pod. They would have UCLA, California, USC, and Stanford in something we'll call the Golden Pod, which is something I think the other 3 pods would object to, but it's the Golden State. That's why I said that. And then you'd have Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, and Washington State in the Northwest Pod. The biggest problem with scheduling for the Pac-16 would be the same kind of idea that was when we moved to the Pac-12. Every team wanted to play in Los Angeles every year for recruiting purposes. That's not going to be able to happen in the Pac-16 system. Maybe if you just play a team from LA, that would kind of substitute being in the actual county. The idea would probably go something like this with the way the pods would work in the system. So you would have Pod A, you would play all of the other 3 teams in your pod. Then you would play all of the teams in 2011 in Pod B. That would be 7 conference games, and since the Pac-12 moved to 9 already anyway, you would play 1 team from Pod C and 1 team from Pod D. And maybe they could do kind of the NFL thing, where they say, all right, the Midwest is going to be paired this year with the Golden Pod, and then if you finish 3rd in your pod, you would play the 3rd place team from the other 2 pods, and that would make up the 8th and 9th conference games of the season. And that's kind of what the NFL does whenever they schedule, in 2019, the NFC East will play a team from the NFC West. It's the same ranking from 2018 is how they would apply it to make that schedule. I hope that makes sense. So let's say that Texas finished 2017 at number 2 behind Oklahoma, who went to the playoff this year. We'll say they finished number 2 behind the Sooners in the Midwest pod. So in 2018, when the Pac-12 or Pac-16 is building their schedule, they would say, okay, well, Texas is going to play all of the teams in the Midwest pod, and we'll say that they're paired with the Golden Pod. So they'll play all 4 teams in the Golden Pod. Then they would also play the 2nd best team from 2017 in the Mountain Pod and the Northwest Pod, and that's how they would make it kind of an even schedule for everybody. Most likely, the conference championship game would have a little bit more leeway, a little bit more pliability in who they put in, because something that has been dogging a lot of conference championship games over the last few years is clearly Clemson and Florida State over the last 5 or 6 years has been the best two teams in the ACC, yet they could not play for a championship. Alabama, Auburn, LSU, whoever, has typically been the best teams in the SEC, yet they couldn't play each other for a conference championship. If you have 4 pods, you have more ways to pick. You can put in extra rules, or you could do something that I think would be interesting, but is never going to happen, and that's a playoff for the conference championship. You could have 2 pods play against each other, and the winner play in the Pac-12 championship. I keep saying Pac-12. It's so weird to say Pac-16. Play in the Pac-16 championship, but again, that's not going to happen. That's just getting a little too crazy with the idea of playoffs. So that's probably how the Pac-16 would have worked. Now, that's great for them. What about the rest of the country? What kind of a ripple effect would this do to the other conferences around the nation? Well, I think for a couple of years, they would sit back and look at the TV deals the Pac-16 got, look at the money each school is going to get, look at the widening, footprint, geographical footprint, the TV market expansion, what kind of deals they do with things like DirecTV and other kind of networks, what the Pac-16 network would look like, if there would be branches off of more Longhorn networks, if you had a Sooners network and a Trojans network, and what that would look like. But let's assume that they all agree that's a pretty lucrative thing the Pac-16's got there. We need to do the same thing. Other teams, other conferences would push for 16-team super conferences all across the country. So let's say all of the conference realignment that actually happened in our timeline happens in this timeline as well. Some of this happened before there would have been a Pac-16. Some of it happened afterwards, but let's keep it the way it happened. So let's say Nebraska, Rutgers, Maryland joined the Big Ten, Texas, Missouri joined the SEC, Louisville, Syracuse, and Pittsburgh joined the ACC. Okay, so those happen regardless. What happens with the rest of the Big 12? I mean, I guess theoretically they could cobble together a conference and kind of try to compete with some of the big boys, but with all of the departures, who's left in that conference? Remember, there's no TCU or West Virginia at this point, just the other remaining members, which are Baylor, Iowa State, Kansas, and Kansas State. Not exactly the pillars of one of the most successful conferences in the country. Instead, I think we do see the demise of the Big 12 and watch the other teams kind of scatter into the wind into other conferences. I think in this scenario that Iowa State and Kansas would have joined the Big Ten. I think it is a natural fit. Kansas, with their academics and their Big Ten dominance in basketball over the years, would be a perfect fit. And Iowa State has the same kind of resume that Iowa has, gives them an extra partner in the West, an extra built-in rivalry in the Big Ten. They already have a trophy, so they fit in perfectly with Big Ten football rivalries. And I sat down and tried to do pods with every conference, and it got really murky. The Pac-16 would be set up perfectly for it. The Big Ten, not quite as much because you have the Michigan-Ohio State issue, and then potentially on how you sliced it, a Minnesota-Wisconsin issue, and you want to kind of keep some of these rivalries together. So for most of these conferences, they could do the pods, or they may just split it right down the middle and do 8-team divisions. I think in this scenario, the SEC doesn't get teams from Group of 5. I think they make a serious run to raid the ACC and try to get NC State and Virginia Tech. Around this time, these were teams I was hearing as rumors that the SEC was talking to and trying to pursue. Virginia Tech, I'm not sure because of Virginia. They kind of fought for a while to get in the same conference with Virginia, and now they were going to give that up to go to the SEC. I don't know, but obviously SEC versus ACC rivalries on the last weekend of the year is not unprecedented. It's not ridiculous. In fact, it's kind of the norm for a lot of the conference. So that would be fine, as would NC State versus North Carolina. NC State, who, from my experience, has always felt like the little brother to North Carolina, has always felt like they pushed around, they helped dictate scheduling for the ACC, they get calls their way in games, them and Duke. Maybe the idea of jumping ship and going to a more powerful brand in the SEC would be pretty alluring. I don't think that would probably have happened. I think the ACC would have done their best to pony up. I think they could lose Maryland and it was kind of okay, but losing NC State and Virginia Tech, that would not be so good with the ACC. So if that's the case, then who does the SEC turn to? Well, ideally, you want them to go 2 teams in the East to kind of solve the whole Auburn being in the East would fix a lot of problems thing. You don't want to split up the Iron Bowl. Auburn has rivalries with Ole Miss and LSU. You don't really want to mess with that, so I would prefer them to go 2 teams to the East. But if you look, other than rating the ACC, I don't really know 2 teams in the East that kind of fit to where the SEC typically operates in the Southeast and is worth it. Maybe they go for either UCF or USF and get West Virginia. But I think the 2 best available teams that's somewhere near the SEC is TCU and West Virginia. So how they divide the divisions, I don't know. Maybe they keep Missouri in the East for some reason. Maybe they move Vandy to the West. I don't know. I don't know what they would do. But I think they probably get TCU and West Virginia. Not that the ACC cares too much about geography, because Louisville, I'm not sure if you know this, the state of Kentucky doesn't actually touch the Atlantic coast, but because of their Miami to Syracuse run up and down the East Coast, they do have a little bit more availability. Now, would this be enough to push Notre Dame into joining the ACC full-time, which they have a contract with? If the Irish ever do join a football conference, it will be the ACC. By the court of law, it has to be the ACC. So will this finally push the Irish to abandon their proud independence and join the ACC? I don't know, but the ACC may feel like they need to act quickly, and if Notre Dame is even skittish at all, they may have to move on to other contenders right away in order not to fall behind the building arms race between the other conferences. They have a couple of targets. I think UCF and USF would be natural fits. They make sense. That would make the ACC dominate the state of Florida, though you already do have 2 teams in the state of Florida. Would you want to go the same way you've done with North Carolina and now have 4 teams in the same state? I don't know. Other options include East Carolina. Again, already enough North Carolina schools. Temple, you already have 1 school in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, but Temple is the Philly market. It's on the opposite end of the state. Maybe that makes sense. What about Navy? They can replace your presence in Maryland. They have a proud tradition of rivalries, in the area. Maybe Navy makes sense. I think the ACC probably does the UCF-USF pull, especially if you look at where we are in 2017, 2018 now. It makes a lot more sense than it probably did in 2011, 2012. But Orlando and Tampa are great markets. You would put a lockdown on Florida, so I think that might be what the ACC ends up doing. I mean, I guess they could go more westward with Memphis or Marshall. I don't really know. Arkansas State, Troy. I mean, I don't see that kind of a movement happen if they had to go to 16 teams, but who really knows? So in closing, it would be absolutely chaos for a few years. If this had happened, the college football world would have been reshaped in a way that is almost unfathomable. We think it was crazy looking back now how different things are than they were in 2010. But if we had gone to the grab-all of 16-team conferences, it would be a lot different looking than it is right now. And the way rivalries go, we would have abandoned even more old rivalries, and we would establish new ones, which in 100 years would be great, but we live right now, and I like the old rivalries. I want those rivalries back. What would happen to Kansas State? We've already lost teams like Oklahoma and Nebraska and Texas A&M. Now we're going to lose even more. That would not be good. The amount of money and scrutiny and media presence that would be pumped into college football would be probably more than it already is today. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. I'm not really sure. And of course, the ripple down through the group of 5 where they had to kind of cobble together teams and conferences in order to maybe keep up with 16 teams or just fend off the conferences trying to poach their teams. They would probably incorporate some FCS teams, and I think even the FCS would have to recoup by getting Division II teams, and it would just kind of trickle down. That would have been kind of interesting to see where teams ultimately ended up and what a conference championship game would look like, what the pod system would look like, if that would even be successful. I think it would have been as close to the feeling of college football Armageddon as we ever will get. I don't think it's a possibility now with Utah having gone, but who knows? At one point in time, the entire Big 12 South, almost, minus Baylor, would have gone and joined the Pac-12, Pac-10, and made the Pac-16. It would have been pure chaos. So there you have it, my quick little take on what if the Pac-16 had actually formed. Now it's your turn. Let me know down below in the comment section what it would have looked like if you would have liked to have seen a Pac-16, if you think that the Big 12 would have survived, and what teams do you think would have been added to the conferences if they expanded from their current 14 to 16 teams. Let me know all that down below in the comment section. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. You can also click on the circle right there in order to subscribe or watch any of the other videos over there to the right that YouTube has suggested for you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, until next time. Superconference, and the Pac-16 went the route of the WAC, the original 16-team conference, and tried to have a super conference that really dominated everything west of the Mississippi. What would that have looked like? What would have been the repercussions across the college football landscape? Of course, we don't really know what could have happened, but here is one possible timeline. Now, the Pac-16 would be perfectly set up if they decided to do the pods. That's the idea that the WAC had of 16 world at that time. It's almost impossible to forget what was going on. Texas, officially the unofficial crown jewel and leader of the Big 12 Conference, was in serious talks with Larry Scott, who was the commissioner of the Pac-10, in order to take themselves and half of the Big 12 with them to form the Pac-16, which even now sounds really weird when I say it. And original talks was Colorado, Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Texas A&M. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Nebraska bolted for the Big Ten, along with eventually Maryland and Rutgers, and Texas A&M and Missouri went eastward towards the SEC, and the Big 12 stayed exactly how it was, with those members getting TCU and West Virginia, as Colorado and Utah ended up joining the Pac-10, making it the Pac-12. But what if that didn't happen? What if we really did have the very first... Hey lifers, Dustin here, and in this video I want to do a little bit of a follow-up slash other leg of my what if the Big 12 had stayed intact video that I put out a little while ago, and this one is going to be what if the Pac-16 had formed. Now, in June of 2010, the college football equivalent of a nuclear explosion, an impending nuclear attack, was basically forming and running wild on the internet. Anybody that was paying attention to the college football teams with 4 teams in each pod, if they decided to do this, it sets up perfectly. They would have Texas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma State being in one pod. We'll call that the Midwest pod, or we'll call it the Midwest pod. They would have Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State in something we'll call the Mountain Pod. They would have UCLA, California, USC, and Stanford in something we'll call the Golden Pod.